Let's continue on with this conversation. I'd like to bring onto the program visiting assistant professor at UC Irvine, Dr. Alon Burstein. Alon, always good to see you. Lots to unpack there. So let's just first start with what you took away from that address to Congress that Netanyahu had earlier today. Anything that really stood out to you the most?
I mean, as you said, first of all, good to see you. Well, it's been a while. As you said, there's so much to take away from this. The speech went on for 52 minutes. Netanyahu really tried to position Israel and the United States, and essentially Israel and the quote-unquote Western world on one side versus them on the other. Them is Hamas. Them is Hezbollah. Them is the Houthis. Them is Iran. He mentions the Nazis. He mentions 9/11. He mentions the attacks that occurred in 1998 in Africa against U.S. embassies. It was all on us versus them, which is really his attempt to, quote unquote, mend bridges. Like, there's been a lot of bad blood between the Netanyahu administration and the Biden administration over the last several months. We've seen the relationship almost deteriorate linearly since the war began, when at first there was that famous hug you showed the pictures before between Biden and Netanyahu. But then as time goes on, we see more and more criticism being raised by the Biden administration against the way Netanyahu is running the war, against the fact that Netanyahu did not seem to have a day after plan. And really what Netanyahu tried to do here was, on the one hand, position Israel and the United States in the same camp versus another camp, and at the same time also start to mend bridges, both with the Democratic Party, but also with the Republican Party. He heaps a lot of praises. He also talks about other things that Trump did in terms of the Abraham Accords, what he tries to reframe as the Abraham Alliance. So really, we saw Netanyahu make a big step here to try to show what he is showing as a given. We are all on the same side, and let's make sure we all understand who is on the other side. And I think the biggest moment of that in the speech is when he explicitly said, when Hezbollah is fighting Israel, they say we are actually fighting the bigger enemy, the United States. When Israel is fighting the nuclear weapons of Iran, Israel is trying to fight the nuclear weapons that are going to hit the United States. It's really trying to say Israel is the sort of forward command almost of the US in the Middle East. Therefore, it's implicit, give Israel the arms, give Israel the leeway, give Israel a diplomatic umbrella in order to carry on the war. I think that was mostly what he tried to at least parlay to in that speech to the American population.
Okay, Alon, lots to unpack with the speech and also with that answer that you just gave us. So let's kind of tear it down in parts here. Let's talk about the tensions between the U.S. and Israel. And I'd like to pull up some video from earlier today. Take a look at this. So during this video, we're going to see the Prime Minister kind of walk through the halls of Capitol Hill. You see a lot of Congress members there standing up, giving him a round of applause. But we also see something very interesting that a lot of eyes are on throughout social media, throughout the internet. And that is when he walks past the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. You're going to see it in just a moment, but he kind of doesn't really say much to him. I mean, you see him here shaking the hands of so many different congressional leaders in Capitol Hill, and once we see him walk past Chuck Schumer, you can kind of see that tension that we have been talking about. So while we wait for that to kind of pop up here in this video, maybe detail for our viewers a little bit more on why there was so much protest from some congressional leaders on even attending this, why some of them are outraged that he has been given the fourth opportunity to address the joint session of Congress.
Look, obviously, the Israel-Hamas war is one of the most divisive topics in the United States, some could argue in the world. And one of the things that has really happened, and we've seen this happen in the last decade, is that the support for Israel in the United States, which used to be completely bipartisan, has gradually become more of a, some would say, partisan issue. Some would say divisive issue. Here, we just saw that snub as you walked past. Some would say partisan issue. Some would say more divisive issue. In particularly the Democratic Party, we see more of the progressive voices that are being more critical, sometimes of Israel, but often more focusing actually on the American support for Israel. It's less always criticism of what Israel does, and more saying, should the United States continuously give Israel the open check, continuously give Israel the military support, the diplomatic support. We saw this already with the bad relationship that developed between Netanyahu and Obama. We then saw the very good relationship that developed between Netanyahu and Trump. that relationship got much worse right at the end when Trump was very angry with Netanyahu for congratulating Biden on his victory back in 2020. But we've seen this become a divisive issue. Now, in the current moment, what has happened in the last several months is there started to be a big divide between Israel and the United States over the trajectory the war is going, I would say since roughly March. Since roughly March, April, after Israel, the IDF had taken over the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, had taken over the southern main city in the Gaza Strip, Han Yunis, and was turning its sights towards Rafah, where most of the civilian population was in the Gaza Strip. The United States started to say, and at first they were saying, we will support an invasion of Rafah. Tell us why. Tell us how this is going to lead to a day after plan. How is this going to bring a better future to Israel, to the Palestinians, to the Middle East, to the Gaza Strip? Something other than the war is just going to be echoed more and more from within the U.S. administration, up until the point where Secretary of State Blinken openly said, we think that the invasion of Rafah will be wrong. We think that that Israel's not doing what's good for Israel and not doing what's good for the war. There's starting to be all kinds of leaks that the administration feels that Netanyahu is prolonging the war solely for his internal political gain in Israel, something else we could talk about. And with that, we started to see the tension rise over the last several months. Then comes this invitation that was initiated actually on the Republican side, comes the invitation to speak to Congress. So it becomes a very divisive issue. Should Democrats in the House, should they be endorsing Netanyahu when in fact he is growing further and further apart from the administration under President Biden? And at the same time, this is somewhat of a snub to Biden, saying, well, you didn't invite Netanyahu to the DC. Okay, maybe the Republicans will try to initiate something. That's how this becomes such a divisive issue. And of course, we can't go without talking about the elephant in the room, the election year, right? This is coming right after Biden has pulled out of the race, and the support for Israel, and more than that, how should Israel be supported, is really a question that has become a question between the parties. Should Israel just be supported in whatever it does? Should it be given sort of an open check of the United States? Or more the Biden approach, should Israel be supported, but also in the sense that if the administration, and Chuck Schumer's approach, if Israel's doing what the administration feels is wrong for Israel, is wrong for Israel's future, should the United States start to be more critical? That's really the question between the parties at this point in terms of their open support for Israel.
Alon, there on your screen, you can kind of see the Senator Chuck Schumer kind of sitting there with his legs crossed and kind of frown on his face. And I would like to bring up this tweet from the Associated Press. This was back a couple of months ago, I believe. It says here, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on Thursday called on Israel to hold new elections, saying he believes Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, quote, lost his way, something that you have touched on with that last answer that you gave. A live look right now out there in southern Israel, kind of continue on this conversation here. So earlier today, when Netanyahu addressed Congress, he had vowed to win the war with Hamas, vowed to bring all of the hostages home. Did he lay out a plan, though, for how that was going to happen? We have been within ceasefire negotiation deals for months now and still no official plan. Am I right?
Absolutely. And really, the two goals that the Israeli government has set for the war is the defeat of Hamas, which we've talked about on the channel many times over the last several months. What does that mean? Does that mean killing every Hamas member, Hamas not governing anymore, having no more guns? What does that mean? And bringing the hostages home. So let's start with the hostages. That's what you asked about, the hostage deal. All the negotiations are going on. The one major thing, and this came under a lot of criticism in Israel, one of the major things that Netanyahu failed to mention in his speech is the word hostage deal. That was not mentioned. He says that Israel retrieved up until now 135 hostages, and then he immediately talks about the fact that Noor Gamani is sitting there in the audience and that she was rescued by the IDF. But what he didn't say is that out of those 135, 120 out of the 135 were brought back as a result of a hostage deal and a ceasefire. Only 7 out of the 135 have been rescued by the IDF. The rest are bodies that the IDF has managed to retrieve. So in Israel came under a lot of criticism saying Netanyahu is saying that he's going to win the war and bring back the hostages. Well, if we talk about the hostages, the military operation, the IDF, thus far, is not proving itself in bringing live hostages back. More dead bodies of hostages have been retrieved by the IDF than live hostages. And like I said, 120 out of 135 came back only in a hostage deal. Netanyahu did not mention the word hostage deal or did not reference the ongoing negotiations. Tomorrow, on Thursday, a delegation from Israel was supposed to go to Qatar for negotiations, but today it was announced that they're not going to go, that that's going to be postponed until after Netanyahu meets with Biden and Trump and sees what happens. So that came under a lot of criticism in Israel in terms of if the aim is to bring the hostages home, the military approach thus far has not proven itself. And in Israel, those who are in favor of seeing the hostages come home as the most urgent thing are saying, then you have to go for a hostage deal. But then there's the other part of, then there's the part of and defeating Hamas and achieving this, sort of quote unquote total victory that Netanyahu often talks about. In that, he laid out, I would say, not a plan, but he laid out a vision. He talked about demilitarizing and de-radicalizing the Gaza Strip. He invoked, as Israel often does, he invoked the images of after World War II, denazification plans that occurred in Europe. And he said, we've seen when there's a regime of utter evil, and, invoking the Nazi regime is the ultimate utter evil. We've seen in the regime of utter evil, if you control the area and if you are able to control the education system, make sure that people are in support of coming up with a new culture and a new approach, then you can achieve de-radicalization. That's what has to happen in Gaza. So he did present a vision of Israel having overarching sort of security control and having local Palestinian administration, however, saying they must not want to destroy Israel, they must not want to destroy the Jews. But it's not a plan. It's not an actual plan of, okay, so how does that happen? And that is really what the United States has almost been begging, I would say, Netanyahu to come up with. That's fine. That vision itself does not actually contradict any vision. It's having a local Palestinian administration, having local civil administration, maybe Israel having some sort of overarching security control for a while. How does that happen? How does that actually happen? Because right now what we have is the IDF takes over a territory, it pulls out of that territory, it's a complete power vacuum, and Hamas just comes back. That is what's been happening in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. The IDF this week, launched a massive operation into Han Yunis, which it evacuated already on April 6th, because it says, well, now it's been 3 months, Hamas has rebuilt in Han Yunis, so now the IDF is coming back. So far the vision is not playing out, that the IDF will take over the territory and then there'll be local administration and there'll be some sort of de-radicalization approach. Netanyahu has a vision. It's not different than the vision of the United States. The plan for how it actually comes to be is something that's lacking. The Israeli administration has thus far failed to present it. And I'll say one more thing. It's failed to present it largely, I would argue, because there's internal political problems in Israel that prevent it from being presented. In Netanyahu's government, there are extreme hawkish right-wing elements who all say that if a plan is presented and there is a Palestinian administration, not an Israeli administration, not Israeli settlements, then the government's going to fall apart. And Netanyahu's government will fall if he presents that. So he said in his speech today, Israel does not want to resettle Gaza. He does not want to add settlements to the Gaza Strip. But if he were to present an actual plan for that, his government would be in danger. Thus, this sort of stalemate approach of Israel just continuing and has a vision that's shared with the United States, but not actually developing a plan, is what I think the U.S. fears, and Netanyahu is just going to continue the stalemate for as long as possible.
Alon, one final thing that I would like to get your thoughts on before I let you go. I'm going to pull up a couple of tweets here. This first one from Fox News correspondent Lucas Tomlinson saying President Biden to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House tomorrow. The vice president will meet with him, quote, separately, White House said. And then also the New York Post saying Trump announces plans to meet with Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago Friday. So Alon, tell me, what can we look forward to? What new developments, if there will be any, can we expect from these two upcoming meetings?
Netanyahu is a very, very smart politician, and he knows very much that on the one hand, Israel may be more comfortable right now with the Republican approach to the, like I said, like the open check towards support for Israel as opposed to the support for Israel with criticism of the Democratic side. So on the one hand, there are elements within Israel's government, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who have openly said, yes, Israel hopes for Trump to be elected. On the other hand, Netanyahu is a very good politician, and he knows that he has to maintain very good relations with all sides. He knows that he needs to have a good meeting with Trump as the Republican candidate. He also knows he needs to have a good meeting with Harris as potentially the Democrat candidate. And I would say even more importantly, he knows that Biden is to some extent right now maybe even more tricky for Israel and for Netanyahu in the coming months. Up until now, Netanyahu has been riding on the one hand support from the United States, on the other hand, being very critical of the fact the United States was applying pressure. Once Biden is out of the race, then Biden can afford, if he would want to, I don't necessarily think he wants to, but if he would want to, could even afford to be more critical of Israel. And Netanyahu experienced this already back in 2015 after the elections when Obama did not use the veto power in the UN because he was no longer running for elections, and he chose not to use the veto power in the UN to block a resolution against Israeli settlements. So Netanyahu knows that no matter, first of all, it's important for Israel and for him as the Israeli prime minister to still maintain good relations with both parties. But more than that, it's also very important for him to ensure that he still has a good ear with Biden and still actually feels this is why we saw him thanking Biden profusely in the speech, because he knows that no matter who wins the elections, he still has another, 5 or 6 months to contend with Biden as president, and especially with Biden not running for re-election. If, for example, we were faced with a situation as we were several months ago, where Biden wanted Netanyahu to not order the invasion of Rafah, but he said, we think it's a mistake, we think this. If a similar situation were to come up in the next couple of months, Biden may openly say, well, if that's the case, then we're going to squeeze Israel a different way. We're not going to use our veto power. We're not going to do all kinds of things. So I think Netanyahu is being very strategic in terms of who he's meeting. I don't expect any big statements to come out from these meetings. I think this is all just to make sure that everyone's still on their good side, quote unquote. And then with that, Netanyahu is going to come back to Israel, try to hold his government together and wait for the elections to see where the winds are blowing in terms of what Israel can accomplish next.
All right, and we're going to leave it at that. Dr. Alon Burstein, a visiting professor at UC Irvine. We always appreciate your insight as we continue to track the latest on the war in Gaza and what comes of these meetings as Netanyahu moves through D.C. after that joint session of Congress. Thank you.